Is she even supposed to be here? The whisper wasn't quiet enough. It slipped through the soft hum of conversation and the delicate clink of silverware, landing exactly where it wasn't meant to, right in Sophie Bennett's chest. The ballroom glowed in warm amber light, chandeliers casting soft reflections across polished marble floors, every table dressed in white linen and gold-trimmed glassware that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Laughter floated easily from one group to another, effortless, practiced, like everyone here knew exactly where they belonged. Everyone except her. Sophie sat at the far edge of table 12, her fingers curled tightly around the stem of a water glass she hadn't touched. The reflection in the glass showed her dress, a pale blue piece she had found on clearance 2 years ago, carefully altered by hand, the seams just slightly uneven if you looked too closely. She smoothed it again anyway, as if that might make her invisible. She wasn't supposed to stand out tonight. She had told herself that when she stepped into the venue, clutching the slightly creased invitation that now rested in her purse like proof she hadn't imagined this. She had known the bride once. Before the promotions, before the city penthouse, before the kind of life that required seating charts and guest lists divided by status. Back when they shared coffee on chipped mugs and talked about dreams that didn't involve private jets. But somewhere along the way, Sophie had become a leftover piece of that past. An obligation invite. A name added, but not remembered. The chair beside her had remained empty for over an hour, a silent confirmation that no one had planned to sit there. Conversations formed around her, but never included her, like she was behind glass. She caught fragments. Investment deals, summer homes, someone complaining about a delayed flight from Aspen, and each word only reminded her how far removed she was from this world. She lowered her gaze, focusing on the pattern of the tablecloth, counting the tiny embroidered loops just to keep her hands from shaking. Maybe she could slip out after the first dance. No one would notice. No one had noticed her arrive. Then it happened. A server passed too quickly, a tray tipping just enough for a splash of red wine to arc through the air. It didn't hit hard, just enough to stain the side of her dress, a dark bloom spreading across the pale fabric. A couple of guests nearby paused, their eyes flicking toward her, then away again, polite smiles hiding mild discomfort. Sophie forced a small laugh under her breath, grabbing a napkin and pressing it gently against the stain, as if she could erase the moment before it fully existed. "I'm so sorry," the server whispered, already being called away. "It's okay," Sophie replied quickly, too quickly, like she needed to convince the room as much as the girl. She kept her head down, pressing harder, wishing she could disappear into the soft music that had just begun to swell. That's when the chair beside her moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift, the subtle scrape of wood against marble. She froze for half a second before looking up. A man had taken the empty seat. Not one of the laughing groups. Not someone scanning the room for attention. He set his phone down beside his plate like he had nowhere else he needed to be. His suit was simple, dark, perfectly fitted but without the flashy details others wore. His presence didn't demand attention, but somehow, it changed the air around the table anyway. He glanced at the napkin in her hand, then at the stain on her dress, and instead of the polite smile she expected, there was something else in his expression. Something quieter. "You look like you want to disappear," he said gently. Sophie let out a soft breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her fingers loosening slightly around the napkin. For the first time that night, someone had actually seen her. Not the dress. Not the mistake. Her. She gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I was hoping I was doing a good job of it." The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not in amusement, but in understanding. "Not really," he said. "But you don't have to." The music grew louder as the couple stepped onto the dance floor, the room's attention shifting away from table 12. But Sophie didn't look at the bride or the groom. She was still looking at the stranger who had chosen the one seat no one else wanted. And for reasons she couldn't explain yet, that felt like the most important thing that had happened all night. The music swelled gently as the bride and groom stepped into the center of the ballroom, the spotlight soft and golden, drawing every gaze toward them. But Sophie barely noticed, because for the first time that evening, the weight on her chest had shifted, just slightly, just enough for her to breathe without forcing it. And it was because of the man sitting beside her, a complete stranger who had chosen her table, her empty chair, her quiet corner, as if it had been the most natural decision in the world, as if he had not just crossed an invisible line everyone else had carefully avoided, and that alone made her look at him again, more carefully this time, noticing the small details she had missed in her initial surprise, the clean lines of his suit that spoke of quality without showing off, the calm way he sat, not stiff like the others but grounded, like he was not performing for anyone, and especially not for the room. And it made her curious in a way she had not expected to feel tonight. "I am Sophie," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, less guarded, as if the introduction itself was a small step back into the world she had been trying to hide from. And he turned slightly toward her, his expression steady, present. "Alexander," he replied, and the name settled between them without any weight attached to it. Just a name, not a title, not a signal of anything more, and somehow that made it easier. "So, Alexander," she added with a faint, self-conscious smile, glancing briefly at the dance floor, before looking back at him. "Are you also trying to disappear tonight?" And there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something thoughtful, almost amused but not quite. "No," he said calmly. "I came here to watch people." And that answer surprised her, because it was not what anyone else in this room would have said. They would have talked about connections, about opportunities, about being seen, but not him. And she found herself leaning in just a little, curiosity pulling her forward, despite herself. "And what do you see?" she asked, her fingers still lightly holding the napkin against the faint wine stain, though she had stopped pressing it as hard. And he followed her gaze briefly across the room, watching the clusters of guests, the polished laughter, the careful gestures before returning his attention to her. "I see a lot of people trying to be exactly who they think they should be," he said, his voice low but clear enough that it cut through the noise without needing to rise above it. "And one person who is not." And Sophie blinked, caught off guard, because she had spent the entire night trying to blend in, trying to disappear, trying not to be seen at all, and yet somehow he had seen her anyway, and not in the way she feared, not as someone out of place, but as someone different, and that difference did not sound like a flaw when he said it. "That is not exactly by choice," she admitted quietly, a small, honest laugh escaping before she could stop it. "I do not exactly fit in here." And for a brief second, she braced herself, expecting the polite contradiction, the automatic reassurance people gave when they did not really mean it. But Alexander did not interrupt, did not correct her. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something true, something obvious, and that simple reaction felt more genuine than any compliment could have. "Maybe not," he said, "but that might be the best thing about you." And the words lingered, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just quietly certain, and Sophie felt something shift again, deeper this time, something she had not felt in a long while, the faint, unfamiliar sense that maybe she was not invisible, not here, not tonight, not to him. And as the music softened into the next song and couples began to move more freely across the floor, she realized she was no longer counting the minutes until she could leave. She was listening, actually listening, to the man beside her, the one person in the room who had chosen to sit down when everyone else had chosen to look away. The music shifted again, slower now, the kind that pulled couples closer, and Sophie noticed how the room subtly rearranged itself around the dance floor. Chairs pushed back, conversations softened, attention narrowing into something more intimate, more curated, like every moment here had been designed to look effortless. And yet beside her, nothing about this felt staged, nothing felt rehearsed, and that difference made her forget, just for a second, the stain on her dress, the whispers, the invisible line she had felt the moment. She walked in. "So what do you do, Sophie?" Alexander asked. Not as a formality, but with a quiet interest that made the question feel heavier than it should have, and she hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the napkin now resting loosely in her lap, because this was always the part where things shifted, where people politely disengaged, where curiosity faded into indifference. "I work at a small bookstore," she said finally, her voice steady but careful. "Mostly mornings, sometimes late evenings if they need coverage." And she gave a small shrug, almost apologetic. "It is not exactly impressive compared to all this." Her eyes flickered briefly across the room, the polished suits, the effortless confidence, The kind of wealth that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood. But Alexander did not follow her gaze this time. He stayed focused on her. "It sounds peaceful," he said simply. And she blinked, surprised again, because that was not the response she expected, not even close. "Peaceful," she repeated, a small smile forming despite herself. "That is one way to describe organizing shelves and recommending paperbacks." And he nodded slightly, as if that detail mattered. "You help people find stories," he said, and there was no hint of dismissal in his tone, only recognition. And for a moment, Sophie forgot to guard herself, forgot to minimize what she did. "I guess I do," she admitted, her voice softer now, and something about that exchange settled into her chest in a way that felt unfamiliar, like being seen without being measured. But before she could say anything else, a voice cut through from behind them, sharp but wrapped in politeness. "Alexander." And Sophie turned instinctively, her shoulders tightening just a little, because the tone alone carried a different kind of weight, and the man approaching their table looked exactly like someone who belonged here. Tailored suit, confident posture, the kind of presence that expected attention without asking for it. "We have been looking for you," he continued, offering a brief nod towards Sophie that felt more like acknowledgement than greeting. "The family wants to introduce you to a few people before the next toast." And Sophie felt it immediately. The shift, subtle but undeniable, like a spotlight had suddenly found their table. Like the quiet bubble that had formed around them was beginning to dissolve, and she glanced at Alexander, expecting him to stand, to apologize, to step back into whatever world he had come from. But he did not move right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression calm, almost unreadable. "I will be there in a few minutes," he replied evenly, and the man hesitated, clearly not used to being told to wait. But after a brief pause, he gave a tight smile and stepped away, disappearing back into the crowd, and Sophie exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding her breath again. "You should go," she said quietly, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her dress, the old instinct returning, the need to step aside before she was asked to. "They were looking for you." And for a moment, Alexander said nothing, his gaze steady on her, not dismissing, not rushing, just present. "I am exactly where I want to be," he said finally. And the simplicity of that sentence landed heavier than anything else he had said all night, because it was not just about staying at the table, it was about choosing it, choosing her, in a room where no one else had. And Sophie felt that unfamiliar shift again, stronger this time, like something inside her was beginning to believe it. The music deepened into a slow, steady rhythm, the kind that made conversations soften and glances linger just a little longer. And Sophie became aware of how close the world around her suddenly felt, not in distance, but in attention, because something had shifted at their table, something subtle but noticeable, like a quiet ripple spreading outward, and she could feel it in the way a few nearby guests were beginning to glance over, not openly staring, but curious enough to notice that. Alexander Cole, the man who had just been called away by someone important, was still sitting beside a girl no one seemed to recognize. And that awareness made Sophie instinctively straighten slightly in her chair, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her dress again. Even though she knew the stain was still there, faint but real, a reminder that she did not quite belong in this carefully polished room. "They are going to come back," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of hesitation now. Not because she wanted him to leave, but because she did not want to be the reason he stayed where he was not expected to be. And Alexander followed her glance briefly toward the crowd before returning his attention to her, completely unbothered. "They usually do," he said, and there was a quiet calm in his tone that made it sound like something he had seen 100 times before, something predictable, almost routine, and that contrast only made Sophie more aware of the difference between them, because nothing about this night had felt predictable for her, not the invitation, not the silence, and definitely not him. "You are not like them," she said before she could stop herself, the words slipping out more honestly than she intended, and for a second, she wondered if she had crossed a line, if she had said something she should not have. But Alexander did not react with offense, he simply tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "No," he replied after a moment. "I am exactly like them." And the answer confused her, because everything about Him suggested otherwise. The way he spoke, the way he stayed, the way he listened, none of it matched the carefully curated energy of the room. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more curious than guarded. And he glanced briefly toward the dance floor, where the bride was laughing softly as the groom whispered something to her, the kind of moment that looked perfect from the outside. "Because sometimes you show up for people," he said, "even when you do not stay for the same reasons they do." And Sophie felt that settle somewhere deep, because it sounded like more than just an answer. It sounded like experience, like someone who had learned that belonging and presence were not always the same thing. And before she could respond, the music shifted again, the tempo lifting slightly as the master of ceremonies stepped forward, tapping the microphone with a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly across the room, drawing every eye toward the stage. "Before we continue, we would like to take a moment to recognize a very special guest this evening." And Sophie felt it immediately, the subtle tightening in the air, the way conversations paused mid-sentence, the way attention sharpened, because moments like this were not casual, they were planned, deliberate, and she did not need to turn her head to know what was coming. She could feel it in the way the people near their table had gone just a little quieter, just a little more aware. A close friend of the groom, and someone whose presence tonight means more than words can express. The voice continued, and Sophie's fingers tightened slightly against her dress as her gaze shifted slowly toward Alexander, her breath catching just enough to make her aware of it. Because for the first time since he sat down, she realized there was something she did not know, something important, something everyone else in this room already seemed to understand. And as the master of ceremonies smiled and lifted his hand toward their side of the ballroom, the space around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a name that Sophie had not yet heard, but somehow already felt would change everything. "Alexander Cole," the master of ceremonies announced clearly, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced ease, "lead investor of Cole Ventures, and one of the people who made tonight possible." And the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but controlled in that way only rooms like this could manage. A ripple of recognition moving through the guests, heads turning, postures shifting, conversations pausing just long enough to acknowledge the weight behind the name, and Sophie felt it before she even fully processed it, the shift in energy around her, the subtle straightening of people nearby, the quiet expectation that he would stand, that he would step forward, that he would return to the place where someone like him was supposed to be. And slowly, almost cautiously, she turned her head toward him, her breath catching just enough to make her aware of it, because suddenly everything made sense in a way that left her slightly off balance. The way people had been looking for him, the way that man had spoken to him earlier, the way he carried himself without trying to prove anything. And for a brief second, she wondered how she had not seen it sooner, how she had not recognized that the man sitting beside her, speaking so simply, so calmly, belonged to a completely different world than the one she had been quietly shrinking into all evening. And yet he was still there, still sitting in the same chair, still looking at her, not at the stage, not at the attention being directed toward him. "You should go," she said softly, her voice more distant now, not cold, but guarded in a way it had not been before, because the difference between them had just become undeniable, visible, no longer something she could ignore or soften with conversation. And for the first time since he sat down, she felt that familiar instinct again, the urge to step back before she was reminded she did not belong, before the moment could shift into something uncomfortable, something real. But Alexander did not move right away. He did not rush to stand, did not immediately respond to the expectation hanging in the air. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the stage, acknowledging the call without urgency, before turning back to her, his expression unchanged, steady, almost as if the announcement had not altered anything at all. "I will," he said calmly, "in a minute." And the simplicity of that response only made the distance between them feel sharper. To Sophie, because it showed just how different their realities were, how easily he could choose when to step into that world, while she had never even been part of it to begin with. And she nodded faintly, her gaze dropping to her hands, to the faint stains still marking her dress, a small, quiet detail that now felt like it carried more meaning than it had before. "I did not know," she admitted after a moment, her voice quieter. More careful now, as if each word needed to be placed correctly, to avoid sounding out of place. About you. And he followed her gaze briefly, noticing the shift not in what she said, but in how she said it. The slight distance, the hesitation that had not been there before. That is kind of the point, he replied, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest. And Sophie let out a small breath, something between a laugh and something else she could not quite name, because of course it was. Of course someone like him would not lead with that, would not introduce himself with titles and numbers. But that did not change what it meant, what it implied, what it created between them now that she knew. It changes things, she said quietly. And this time she did not look at him when she said it, because she did not want to see his reaction, did not want to know if he agreed or if he would try to say it did not matter, because to her, it did, it always had, it always would. And for a moment, the noise of the room seemed to return all at once, the music, the voices, the clinking glasses, filling the space between them that had just begun to form. And for the first time since he sat down, Sophie felt the possibility that this moment, whatever it had been, might already be slipping away. The applause began, polite at first, then building just enough to fill the space that had gone quiet. And Sophie felt it like a pressure rather than a celebration, because every clap seemed to push the moment further away from what it had been just seconds ago, further away from the quiet, almost invisible connection that had existed between her and the man now being recognized by an entire room. And she kept her eyes lowered for a moment longer, letting the sound pass over her, trying to gather herself before she looked up again, because she already knew what she would see. People watching, people expecting, people waiting for him to step into the version of himself they understood. And when she finally lifted her gaze, Alexander was still there, still seated, still not moving. And that somehow made everything more complicated, not less. They are all waiting, she said quietly, not as a suggestion this time, but as a simple observation, because the truth of it was impossible to ignore. And he followed her gaze briefly, taking in the room, the attention, the subtle anticipation that had settled over the guests, before returning to her once more, as if that was the only place he needed to look. They can wait a little longer, he replied, his tone calm. But there was something firmer beneath it now, something deliberate, and Sophie felt that in a way she had not expected, because it was not just about staying in his seat anymore. It was about choosing where his attention belonged, and for a second, that choice felt too heavy, too significant for her to carry. You should not do that, she said softly, shaking her head just slightly, her voice steady but laced with something more vulnerable now. Not because of me. And there it was, the line she had been trying to hold on to, the boundary that made things make sense again, that restored the balance she understood, because in her world, people like him did not choose people like her, not in rooms like this, not under lights like these. And Alexander watched her for a moment, really watched her, as if he was trying to understand not just what she was saying, but what she believed. And after a brief pause, he leaned forward just slightly, his voice lowering enough that it felt like it existed only between them, despite the room around them. Sophie, he said, her name steady and certain in a way that made her look up again despite herself. I sat down at this table before anyone called my name. And the words landed slowly, not dramatic, not forced, just clear. Nothing about that has changed. And she felt it, the weight of what he meant, not as a grand statement, but as something simple and undeniable. And yet it did not erase what she now knew. It did not make the difference disappear, and she swallowed softly, her fingers tightening just slightly against the fabric of her dress. It still matters, she said, her voice quieter now, more honest than before. Who you are. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the music softening again as the applause began to fade, replaced by a low murmur of conversation returning to life. But the tension at their table remained, not loud, not visible to everyone, but real enough to be felt. And then Alexander exhaled slowly, a small, almost thoughtful breath, before leaning back in his chair, his gaze still steady on her. Maybe it does, he admitted, and there was no resistance in his voice, no attempt to argue, just acknowledgement. But it does not change what I see when I look at you. And Sophie felt that again, that unfamiliar shift, deeper this time, more unsettling because it was starting to feel real, and just as she opened her mouth to respond, the master of ceremonies spoke again, this time with a lighter tone, guiding the room forward. And now, let us continue with the next dance. And the music rose, filling the space once more, but this time, before Sophie could retreat back into herself, before she could find a reason to step away, Alexander stood, the movement smooth and unhurried, and then he extended his hand toward her, not commanding, not expecting, just offering. "Dance with me," he said, and for a second, Sophie hesitated, not because she did not want to, but because she understood what it meant now, what it would look like, what it would say to everyone watching, and yet, as she looked at his hand, steady and patient, she realized something else too, that for the first time that night, the choice was hers. For a moment, Sophie did not move, her eyes fixed on his hand, as if accepting it would change something permanent, something she would not be able to take back once she stepped onto that floor, because this was no longer just a quiet conversation in the corner, no longer something invisible to the rest of the room. This would be seen, noticed, interpreted, and she could already feel the weight of those eyes before she even stood. The subtle shift of attention waiting to happen, the quiet questions forming in people's minds. And yet, beneath all of that, there was something else, something quieter but stronger, the memory of how he had looked at her when no one else did, the way he had chosen her seat when every other chair had been easier, safer, expected, and slowly, almost cautiously, she placed her hand in his, her fingers light at first, as if testing whether the moment was real, and his grip was steady, warm, not pulling, not rushing, just there, and that was enough for her to stand, her chair sliding back softly against the floor as she rose, aware now of how the room was beginning to notice, how conversations were pausing mid-sentence, how glances were turning more directly in their direction, and she felt it in her chest, that familiar tightening. But this time she did not step back, she did not retreat, because his hand did not let her feel alone in it, and together they moved toward the dance floor. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple walk that somehow carried more attention than anything else happening in the room. And when they reached the edge of the floor, the music wrapping around them in a slow, steady rhythm, Sophie hesitated again for the briefest second, her breath catching as she became fully aware of where she was, of who she was standing with, of what this looked like from the outside. And then Alexander stepped slightly closer, his other hand resting gently at her side in a way that was respectful, grounded, leaving space for her to choose how close she wanted to be, and that small detail settled something inside her, enough for her to follow his lead as they began to move, slow at first, almost tentative, matching the rhythm of the music rather than the expectations around them. And for a few seconds, everything else faded. The voices, the whispers, the weight of the room, replaced by something simpler, the quiet coordination of steps, the steady presence of someone who was not trying to impress or perform, just to be there, with her. "You are not worried about this," she said softly after a moment, her voice low enough that it stayed between them, and he shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "No," he replied. "Are you?" And she let out a small breath, something close to a laugh, because the honest answer was yes. She was, more than she wanted to admit, more than she wanted him to see. But instead of saying it, she glanced briefly past his shoulder, catching the looks now, the subtle curiosity, the unmistakable recognition in some faces, the quiet judgment in others, and for a second, the old instinct returned, the urge to shrink, to disappear, to step away before she was reminded again of where she stood. But then she looked back at him, at the calm in his expression, at the way none of that seemed to touch him, and something inside her shifted, not completely, not all at once, but enough for her to hold his gaze and answer honestly. "A little," she admitted, and he nodded once, not dismissing it, not trying to take it away, just acknowledging it. "That makes sense," he said, and then, after a brief pause, his voice softer now. "But you are still here," and the words landed gently, but they carried something stronger beneath them, something that made her realize that this moment was not about the room, not about the people watching, not even about who he was. It was about the fact that she had not walked away, that she had stayed, that she had chosen to step forward instead of back. And as they continued to move, The rhythm becoming more natural, more fluid, Sophie felt something she had not expected to feel tonight. Not confidence exactly, but something close to it, something like belonging, even if it was only for the length of a song, even if it only existed in the space between two people who had chosen each other in a room that had not. The music carried them forward, smooth and unhurried, each step falling into place with a quiet ease that Sophie had not expected, and for a few moments, it almost felt like the rest of the room had faded into the background, like the whispers and glances had softened into something distant, something that did not quite reach them. But that illusion did not last long, because slowly, almost inevitably, the awareness returned, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable pieces, a pause in conversation here, a lingering glance there, a shift in posture from those who recognized exactly who Alexander was, and began to question who she was to be standing so close to him. And Sophie felt it again, that subtle tightening in her chest, the old instinct rising, the awareness of difference pressing in from all sides. And this time it was not just imagined, it was visible, real, carried in the eyes that followed them across the floor, and she caught a fragment of it as they turned. Slightly, a woman near the edge of the dance floor leaning toward her companion, her voice low but not low enough. Who is she? And the answer that followed was softer, less certain. I do not know. And those 4 words, simple as they were, landed heavier than any judgment could have, because they confirmed exactly what Sophie had feared from the moment she walked into the room, that she did not belong to this world, that she existed here without context, without explanation, without a place. And her steps faltered just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough that Alexander felt it, his hand steadying her gently, not correcting, not drawing attention, just grounding. Hey, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise without force. Stay with me. And she looked up at him, her expression shifting, not breaking, but strained now, the confidence she had started to build slipping just enough to reveal the doubt underneath. They are all looking, she admitted, her voice barely above the music, and he nodded once, not denying it, not pretending otherwise. I know, he said, and the calm in his response should have helped. But instead it made the moment feel more real, more undeniable, and Sophie glanced past him again, catching another look, this one sharper, more assessing, as if she were something out of place that needed to be understood, categorized, explained, and for a second, the urge to step back, to pull her hand away, to end this before it turned into something she could not control, returned stronger than before. Maybe I should not have done this, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. But he heard it. Of course he did. And his expression shifted just slightly, not into frustration, not into insistence, but into something more focused, more deliberate. And as the music slowed into the final measures of the song, he guided her gently to a stop, not releasing her hand, not stepping away, just creating a still moment between them in the middle of everything else. Sophie, he said, her name steady again, anchoring. Look at me. And she did, even though part of her wanted to look anywhere else, because his voice left no room for avoidance. And when their eyes met, the noise of the room seemed to dull again, not disappear, but soften just enough for his words to matter more. You are not here by accident, he said, and there was no hesitation in his tone, no doubt, just certainty. You were invited, you showed up, and you stayed. And each word landed like a quiet counterweight to everything she had been telling herself, everything she had been trying to shrink into. That matters, he added, and Sophie felt something shift again, not completely erasing the doubt, not silencing the room, but pushing back against it, just enough to give her space to breathe, to stand, to remain exactly where she was. And as the music came to a gentle close and the applause began again, softer this time, more casual, she realized that for the first time since stepping onto that floor, she had not looked away, she had not stepped back, she had stayed, even with all eyes on her, even with everything telling her she should not. And that, more than anything else, felt like the beginning of something she did not yet fully understand. The applause faded into a soft hum of conversation, the kind that returned quickly in a room like this, where moments were acknowledged and then set aside just as easily. But for Sophie, nothing felt easy anymore, not after standing in the center of it all, not after feeling every glance, every unspoken question, and as Alexander's hand gently released hers, she felt the shift immediately. The fragile sense of steadiness she had found during the dance slipping just slightly as reality returned in full, and she took a small step back, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress as if grounding herself, reminding herself of where she stood. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice sincere but quieter now, more contained, and he nodded, his expression unchanged, as if the moment they had just shared did not need to be explained or defined. "You did not need to thank me," he replied, and there was no formality in his tone, just a simple truth. But before Sophie could respond, before she could find her footing again, the space around them began to fill, not suddenly, not aggressively, but inevitably, like a current pulling in the direction it had always intended to go, and she saw them approaching, 2 men and a woman, all dressed with the same effortless precision as the rest of the room, their attention focused entirely on Alexander, their smiles polite but purposeful. "There you are," one of the men said, his voice carrying the kind of familiarity that came from shared status rather than shared connection. "We have been trying to find you." And Sophie felt it instantly, the shift from being seen to being overlooked, because none of them asked who she was, none of them included her in the moment. She was simply there, adjacent, unaccounted for, and she stepped back another inch without realizing it, creating space, the kind she knew how to create, the kind that made things easier for everyone else. "We have a few people you should meet before the next toast," the woman added, her tone warm but practiced, her gaze flicking briefly towards Sophie before returning to Alexander, as if she had already decided where the focus belonged. And for a second, Sophie thought this was it, the moment the night would return to what it was supposed to be, where he would nod, excuse himself, step back into the version of his world that made sense, leaving her to quietly find her way out of it. And she lowered her gaze slightly, preparing for that, preparing for the distance to become permanent. But Alexander did not move right away. He did not immediately follow their lead. Instead, he glanced briefly at them, acknowledging their presence, before turning back to Sophie. Just for a second, just long enough for her to see it, that same steady attention, that same choice. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that the small group could hear. "Give me a minute," he said, and the words landed differently this time. Not casual, not negotiable, but firm in a way that made the others pause, their expressions shifting slightly, not offended, but surprised, because people like him were not expected to delay for moments like this, not in rooms like this. And Sophie felt it again, that unexpected pull between staying and stepping away, because now the attention was sharper, more focused, more aware of her presence in a way that felt impossible to ignore. "You do not have to do that," she said quietly, her voice careful, almost urgent now, because the last thing she wanted was to become a reason for tension, for disruption, for something that did not belong to her. But Alexander simply met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "I know," he said, and then, after a brief pause, softer this time, "I want to." And something about that choice, that clarity, made everything else fade just slightly again. Not the room, not the people, but the weight of what they represented, and Sophie realized, standing there in the middle of a space she had never expected to occupy, that this was no longer just about being noticed or not noticed. It was about what happened when someone chose not to look away, and whether she was ready to stand in that choice without stepping back. The small circle around them did not move away. It did not dissolve back into the room like Sophie had hoped. Instead it lingered, subtle but present, like a spotlight that refused to dim, and she could feel the difference now more than ever, not just in the glances, but in the silence that followed Alexander's words, the kind of silence that carried expectation, that waited for him to correct himself, to shift back into alignment with what everyone else understood. And for a brief second, no one spoke, until the man who had first approached cleared his throat lightly, his smile still in place but thinner now, more controlled. "Of course," he said, though the tone suggested something else, something closer to surprise than agreement. "We will be right over there when you are ready." And with that, the small group stepped back, not fully retreating, but repositioning themselves just far enough to give the appearance of space while still keeping him within reach. and Sophie felt the pressure of that arrangement immediately. The awareness that this moment was no longer private, no longer contained, and she turned slightly toward Alexander, her voice lower now, more urgent. "You should go," she said, not because she wanted him to, but because she understood what staying meant now, what it signaled, what it disrupted, and she did not want to be the reason for that disruption. They are not going to stop waiting. And he watched her for a moment, really watched her, as if measuring not just her words but the intention behind them, the instinct she kept returning to, the one that told her to step aside before she was asked to. And slowly, he nodded once, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. "I know," he said, and then, after a brief pause, "But neither are you." And the words caught her off guard, because she had not realized that she had been waiting too, waiting for this to end, waiting for the moment to reset, waiting to return to being invisible where things made sense again. And she let out a small breath, her fingers brushing lightly against her wrist, grounding herself in something simple, something real. "This is not my world," she said quietly, the truth of it steady, familiar, something she understood completely. And for a second, she expected him to argue, to soften it, to tell her it did not matter. But he did not. Instead, he nodded again, more slowly this time. "Maybe not," he said, and there was no denial in his voice, no attempt to rewrite what she already knew. "But you are in it right now," he added, and that shift, that small reframing, made her look up at him again. Because it did not erase the difference, it did not pretend it was not there, but it also did not push her out of the moment. It did not make her smaller inside it. And before she could respond, the master of ceremonies' voice returned, lighter now, guiding the room forward once more, announcing the next toast, and the attention began to shift again, slowly pulling away from them, redistributing itself across the ballroom. And Sophie felt the tension ease just slightly, enough for her shoulders to relax, enough for her to think clearly again. And she glanced toward the table where she had been sitting earlier, the empty chair still there, waiting, unchanged, like a quiet reminder of where she had started the night. And then she looked back at Alexander, at the man who had stepped into that empty space without hesitation, without question, and she realized that whatever happened next, whatever this became or did not become, something had already changed, not in the room, not in the people watching, but in her, in the way she had stayed, in the way she had not walked away when it would have been easier. And for the first time since she noticed the difference between them, she did not feel the need to apologize for it. She simply stood there, present, exactly where she was. The room shifted again as the next toast began, glasses lifting, soft laughter returning, the carefully curated rhythm of the evening reasserting itself as if nothing unusual had happened at all. And yet for Sophie, everything felt different now, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, like the edges of the moment had sharpened just enough for her to see where she stood without trying to blur it. And she remained beside Alexander, not stepping back this time, not retreating toward the safety of distance, just standing there as the voices around them rose and fell. And for a brief moment, it felt almost normal, until it did not, because across the room, she caught it again, not just glances now, but recognition turning into assumption, quiet conversations forming with more certainty, and one voice, slightly too audible, carried just enough to reach her. She must be someone important. And another followed, softer but edged with skepticism, or someone new. And Sophie felt the words land differently this time, not like questions, but like attempts to explain her presence in a way that fit their world. And for the first time, it was not the exclusion that unsettled her, it was the sudden need to categorize her, to assign her a place she had not claimed. And she looked down briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the side of her dress, the faint stain still there, a quiet contradiction to whatever story they were beginning to build about her. And she let out a small breath, not anxious, not embarrassed, just aware. "They are trying to figure me out now," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of something new, something steadier. And Alexander glanced toward the direction of the voices before returning his attention to her. "People usually do that when something does not fit their expectations," he replied, and there was no judgment in his tone, just observation. And Sophie nodded faintly, because she understood that. She had lived that, just from the opposite side. Always the one who did not fit. Always the one who was quietly overlooked rather than quietly examined. And now, standing here, she realized how different those two experiences felt, how one made you invisible, and the other made you visible in a way that demanded explanation, and neither was entirely comfortable. "I am not sure which is worse," she admitted, a small, thoughtful smile touching her lips, and he considered that for a moment before answering. "The one where you forget who you are," he said, and the simplicity of it made her pause, because it was not about them, not about the room, not about the difference between their worlds. It was about something more personal, more internal, and she looked at him again. Really looked this time, not at the idea of who he was, not at the title that had been announced, but at the way he moved through all of this without letting it define him completely, and for the first time since the reveal, she did not see the gap between them as something fixed, something impossible. She saw it as something that existed, yes, but did not have to control every moment, every choice. And as the toast concluded and the applause rose again, she found herself standing a little straighter, not because the room had changed, not because the people had changed, but because she had stopped trying to shrink inside it. And when she glanced back toward table 12, toward the empty chair that had once felt like a quiet confirmation of her place, she realized it no longer held the same meaning. Because she was no longer sitting there, waiting to disappear. She was here, in the middle of it all, not because she belonged to their world, but because she had chosen not to step out of it. And that choice, small as it seemed, felt like the most important thing she had done all night. The final notes of the toast faded into a soft ripple of applause, and as the room settled once more into its polished rhythm, something shifted in a way that felt different from before, not just in Sophie, but in the space around her, because the attention that had once questioned her presence had begun to change shape, not entirely welcoming, not fully accepting, but no longer dismissive either. And she could feel it in the way conversations near her paused just a second longer, in the way glances lingered with curiosity instead of quiet judgment. And for the first time that night, she did not instinctively look away. She held her ground, her posture relaxed but steady, as if she had finally found a place within herself that did not depend on the room to define it. And beside her, Alexander remained exactly the same, unaffected by the shifting energy, his presence grounded in a way that made everything else feel less overwhelming. "You are doing it again," he said softly, his voice just enough to reach her without drawing attention, and she turned toward him slightly, a faint smile forming. "Doing what?" she asked, though she already had a sense of what he meant, and he gestured subtly, not toward the crowd, but toward her. "You are staying," he said, and the simplicity of it made her pause, because it was true. She had not stepped back. She had not retreated to the edges. She had not looked for the nearest exit the moment things became uncomfortable. She had remained exactly where she was, even as everything around her shifted. "I think I am just tired of leaving," she admitted quietly, the words surprising even herself as they settled into the space between them, because she had not planned to say that, had not planned to reveal something so honest. But once it was there, it felt right, and Alexander nodded once, not offering reassurance, not softening it, just acknowledging it as something real, something that did not need to be fixed. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the music rising again as the band transitioned into a lighter tune, couples returning to the floor, laughter lifting a little higher now. And Sophie found herself watching it all without the same distance she had felt earlier, not because she suddenly belonged to this world, but because she was no longer measuring herself against it, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. "They're going to come back again," she said after a moment, glancing toward the group that had stepped away earlier, still waiting, still watching, and Alexander followed her gaze briefly before looking back at her. "They always do," he replied, echoing his earlier words, but this time, it carried something more, something closer to inevitability than casual observation, and Sophie nodded, her expression thoughtful, because she understood now that this night was not going to return to what it had been, not for him, not for her, and not for the people watching. "Then maybe you should go to them," she said. But there was no urgency in her voice this time, no quiet attempt to step aside, just a simple recognition of what came next. And Alexander studied her for a moment, as if confirming something unspoken, something that had changed in her without needing to be explained. And then he nodded once, slowly. "I will," he said, and for the first time, the decision did not feel like distance. It did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation, something that would move forward rather than break apart. And as he turned slightly, preparing to step back into the circle that had been waiting for him all along, he paused, just for a second, his attention returning to her one more time. "Do not disappear," he said, quietly, not as a request, not as a command, but as something in between, something that carried meaning beyond the moment itself. And Sophie felt that settle deep, stronger than any of the whispers, stronger than the weight of the room, and she nodded, not because she felt obligated to stay, but because she wanted to, because for the first time that night, staying did not feel like a mistake, it felt like a choice. And as Alexander stepped away, moving back toward the group that had been waiting, the space beside her opened again, but it did not feel empty the way it had before. It felt different, filled with something she could not quite name yet, something that made her remain exactly where she was, not watching the door, not searching for an exit, but standing in the middle of a room that no longer felt like it was trying to push her out. The space beside Sophie remained open, but it no longer felt like something missing. It felt like something waiting. And as the evening continued to unfold around her, she noticed how differently she moved within it now, not drifting toward the edges, not shrinking into the background, but standing where she was with a quiet steadiness that had not been there before. And the room, in its own subtle way, responded, not with full acceptance, not with sudden warmth, but with a shift in tone, the kind that happens when something unfamiliar stops being dismissed and starts being acknowledged. And she felt it in the way a passing guest offered a polite nod instead of a glance that slid past her, in the way a server paused just long enough to ask if she needed anything, in the way the empty chair at table 12 no longer felt like a place she had to return to, because she was no longer defined by it. And across the room, she could see Alexander, now surrounded by the people who had been waiting, engaged in conversations that looked important, expected, aligned with the world everyone assumed he belonged to. And yet, even from a distance, there was something unchanged in the way he carried himself, something that did not fully blend into the polished rhythm around him. And once, just briefly, his gaze lifted, crossing the room until it found her again, and in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter, not the titles, not the expectations, not the quiet judgments that had once filled the space between them, just that simple, unmistakable recognition. And Sophie felt a small smile form, not out of surprise, but out of understanding, because she knew now that whatever this was, whatever it would become, it was not defined by where they stood in the room, but by the choices they had made within it. And as the night moved toward its later hours, the music softening, the conversations deepening, the formal edges of the event beginning to blur into something more relaxed, Sophie found herself no longer counting the time, no longer planning her exit. Instead, she stayed, moving through the space with a quiet confidence that grew with each passing moment, until eventually, as the crowd shifted again and Alexander stepped away from the group that had held him for most of the evening, he made his way back toward her, not hurried, not dramatic, just certain. And when he reached her, there was no need for explanation, no need to revisit what had already been understood. "You did not disappear," he said, a faint hint of a smile in his voice. And Sophie met his gaze without hesitation, her own smile steady now, grounded. "Neither did you," she replied, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the noise of the room fading into something softer, something less important. And then, as the band began to play one final song, slower, quieter, the kind that signaled the night was drawing to a close, Alexander extended his hand again, the gesture familiar now, but carrying something deeper this time, not just an invitation to step onto the dance floor, but an invitation to step forward into whatever came next. And Sophie looked at his hand, then back at him, and this time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing, just a quiet certainty as she placed her hand in his, because she understood now that belonging was not something given by a room, it was something chosen, built moment by moment. And as they moved together once more, not as strangers, not as people separated by the weight of a title, but as two individuals who had seen each other clearly in a room full of expectations. Sophie realized that the most important thing that had happened that night was not that he had chosen to sit beside her. It was that she had chosen to stay.